This is Chapter 18, Module 2, the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. The learning objectives of this module are 1. Identify the role of the hypothalamus in the endocrine system, 2. Discuss the relationship of the hypothalamus and the pituitary, and 3. Describe the structure and functions of the pituitary gland. In the endocrine system, hormones are released from endocrine tissues and organs as needed. They can be triggered by changes in the composition of the extracellular fluid, by the arrival of other types of hormones, or by the arrival of neurotransmitters. When 2 or more hormones are involved, the process is much more complex and may require intermediary steps. The hypothalamus is usually involved in these more complex processes and will release hormones that regulate the release of hormones by other endocrine structures. These hormones will be released in sudden bursts, creating a dramatic increase in the hormones. The hypothalamus controls endocrine function in 3 mechanisms. It controls the production of hormones called ADH and oxytocin. It directs control of sympathetic output to the adrenal medulla, and it secretes regulatory hormones that control the anterior lobe of the pituitary. First, the hypothalamus produces 2 hormones called ADH and oxytocin. ADH and oxytocin are transported through nerve axons to the posterior lobe of the pituitary. From the posterior lobe of the pituitary, they are released into the blood. ADH, or antidiuretic hormone, is a hormone that helps the body to conserve water. It is released during blood loss or dehydration. When released from the posterior lobe of the pituitary into the blood, ADH travels to the kidney, where it binds to its target receptors. This binding will open water channels, so water from the kidney's filtrate will be reabsorbed back into the body instead of being excreted in the urine. Oxytocin is released from the posterior lobe of the pituitary and produces different effects on the male than it does in the female. In the female, oxytocin is released from the posterior lobe of the pituitary when she is in labor or when she is lactating. Oxytocin causes strong contractions of the uterus to enable her to deliver her baby. Oxytocin also targets the mammary glands and allows for milk ejection or letdown to enable her to nurse her baby. In the male, oxytocin causes the release of secretions from the prostate gland, as well as to cause contractions of the smooth muscle lining of the reproductive tract, allowing sperm to be propelled from the testes to the penis. Second, the hypothalamus directs control of sympathetic output to the adrenal medulla. When stimulated, the hypothalamus sends action potentials to the sympathetic nerves exiting the spinal cord from levels T1 to L2. These action potentials will synapse on preganglionic neurons at around the T5 to T8 spinal region. The action potentials generated in the preganglionic neurons will synapse with the neurons of the adrenal medulla, stimulating the release of epinephrine and norepinephrine from the adrenal medulla into the bloodstream. Epinephrine increases heart rate and rushes blood to the muscles and the brain. It also spikes your blood sugar by helping to convert glycogen to glucose in the liver. Norepinephrine works with epinephrine in responding to stress, and it can cause a narrowing of blood vessels that results in high blood pressure. And finally, or third, the hypothalamus releases regulatory hormones that control the activity of the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland. The hypothalamus will release either releasing hormones or inhibiting hormones to control the anterior lobe of the pituitary. The releasing hormones of the hypothalamus will stimulate the synthesis and secretion of 1 or more hormones at the anterior lobe, whereas the inhibitory hormones of the thalamus will prevent the synthesis and secretion of hormones of the anterior lobe. These hormones are carried to the anterior lobe of the pituitary through a small local capillary network called the portal system or hypophyseal portal system. This portal system ensures that the regulatory hormones reach the intended target cells. Once these regulatory hormones reach the anterior lobe of the pituitary, they will trigger the release of other hormones. There are 7 regulatory hormones that the hypothalamus releases that you will need to understand: thyroid-releasing hormone, corticotropin-releasing hormone, gonadotropin-releasing hormone, prolactin-releasing factor and prolactin-inhibiting hormone, growth hormone-releasing hormone, and growth hormone-inhibiting hormone. 1. The thyroid-releasing hormone is released from the hypothalamus and carried to the anterior lobe of the pituitary by the hypophyseal portal system. In the anterior lobe, the thyroid-releasing hormone will bind to specific receptors, triggering the release of thyroid-stimulating hormone from the anterior lobe of the pituitary. The thyroid-stimulating hormone is then released into the blood, where it is then carried to the thyroid gland. At the thyroid gland, the thyroid-stimulating hormone exits the blood and binds to specific receptors in the follicle cells of the thyroid. These follicle cells are then triggered to release the thyroid hormones T3 and T4. T3 and T4 are released into the blood and will target most of the cells of the body, causing them to increase metabolism. In other words, cause them to metabolize their nutrients to produce ATP. 2. The corticotropin-releasing hormone is released from the hypothalamus and carried to the anterior lobe of the pituitary by the hypophyseal portal system. In the anterior lobe of the pituitary, the corticotropin-releasing hormone will bind to specific receptors, triggering the release of adrenocorticotropic hormone. This adrenocorticotropic hormone is released into the blood, where it is then carried to the adrenal cortex. At the adrenal cortex, the adrenocorticotropic hormone binds to specific receptors and triggers the release of hormones called glucocorticoids. These glucocorticoids are involved in controlling the breakdown of stored nutrients for energy use. When released from the adrenal cortex, glucocorticoids enter the blood and travel to cells within the liver and skeletal muscles, where it accelerates the breakdown of glycogen into individual glucose molecules, which the cells of the body can use to create ATP. 3. The gonadotropin-releasing hormone is released from the hypothalamus and carried to the anterior lobe of the pituitary by the hypophyseal portal system. In the anterior lobe of the pituitary, the gonadotropin-releasing hormone causes the release of two hormones, FSH and LH. FSH, or follicle-stimulating hormone, is released from the anterior lobe of the pituitary into the blood, where it travels to the testes in the male and the ovaries in the female. In the testes of the male, FSH binds to the nurse cells of the testes and triggers the production of sperm. In females, FSH binds to the ovarian follicle cells and triggers the production of the oocytes, or female eggs, as well as the secretion of estrogen. LH, or luteinizing hormone, in the male binds to the interstitial cells of the testes and stimulates the production of the androgen hormone called testosterone. And in the female, luteinizing hormone binds to the ovarian follicle cells and stimulates the ovary to release the oocyte at the time of ovulation during her monthly cycle, as well as cause the secretion of the hormone progesterone. 4 and 5. The hypothalamus releases two prolactin regulatory hormones, prolactin-releasing hormone and prolactin inhibitory hormone. These two regulatory hormones will travel to the anterior lobe of the pituitary to trigger the release of prolactin from the anterior lobe. Prolactin inhibitory hormone and prolactin releasing factor have opposite effects. Prolactin releasing factor will stimulate the release of prolactin from the anterior lobe of the pituitary, where it will stimulate milk production in the mammary glands. Milk production will only normally occur in a lactating female. Prolactin inhibitory hormone will inhibit the release of prolactin from the anterior lobe of the pituitary for times when the female is not lactating. You may have noticed the releasing hormone is actually termed a factor instead of a hormone, which simply means the molecular structure of the hormone is not completely established. These opposing regulatory hormones are not released at the same time from the hypothalamus, as it wouldn't make sense to have one hormone stimulating the release of prolactin from the anterior lobe while the other one is inhibiting its release. 6 and 7. The hypothalamus releases two growth hormone regulatory hormones, growth hormone releasing hormone and growth hormone inhibitory hormone. These regulatory hormones control the release of growth hormone from the anterior lobe of the pituitary. When released, they travel through the hypophyseal portal system to the anterior lobe of the pituitary, where they will bind to receptors. Growth hormone releasing hormone will stimulate the release of growth hormone from the anterior lobe, and growth hormone inhibiting hormone will inhibit the release of growth hormone from the anterior lobe. When released, growth hormone targets the liver and stimulates the liver to release hormones called somatomedins. Somatomedins target skeletal muscle, cartilage, and many other tissues to cause growth in these tissues. The pituitary gland is also called the hypophysis. It rests in the sella turcica of the sphenoid bone, hanging inferiorly from the hypothalamus by a narrow stalk called the infundibulum. The pituitary gland is divided into three groups: the anterior lobe, otherwise known as the adenohypophysis, the posterior lobe, otherwise known as the neurohypophysis, and the intermediate lobe. The pituitary gland releases 9 important hormones that you need to know: thyroid-stimulating hormone, adrenocorticotropic hormone, growth hormone, prolactin, follicle-stimulating hormone, and luteinizing hormone. The posterior lobe releases the hormones ADH and oxytocin. The intermediate lobe releases the hormone melanocyte-stimulating hormone, or MSH. MSH is released into the bloodstream, and many of its effects on the body are uncertain, other than we know it stimulates the production of melanin from the melanocytes in the epidermis. The other hormones we will discuss in more depth in other modules. This ends Chapter 18, Module 2, the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland.